US President Donald Trump wants to make America rich again by increasing tariffs on foreign goods. Currently, he's got his eyes on steel and aluminium imports. But will tariffs be enough to boost the US economy? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the US President Donald Trump believes both friend and foe have been giving the US a bad deal when it comes to trade. He's ordered his team to design a new set of reciprocal import tariffs, frustrating allies like the UK and the EU. So, is this the beginning of Trump trade wars once more?
A reciprocal makes tariffs really fair.
Donald Trump believes the US is being treated unfairly in global trade. In response, he wants to raise tariffs on imports into the US.
Making America rich again.
He has already raised tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from 10% to 25%, impacting countries such as the UK and in the EU. The UK government wants to avoid a trade war with its largest single trading partner, the US.
It's about £400 million worth of exports from UK steel goes to the United States. That represents about, if I recollect accurately, 10% of UK productions.
The EU has called Trump's tariffs unjust and vows a firm response.
Unjustified tariffs on the European Union will not go unanswered. And let me speak plainly. We are one of the world's largest markets. We will use our tools to safeguard our economic security and interests.
Trump pledged to bring down consumer prices during his campaign, but is admitting costs could go up in the short term because of these tariffs. The US president's proposals risks reviving trade tensions seen during his first term. How many more trade tariffs will Trump introduce?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining me in the studio here, we have Maurizio Zanardi. He is Professor of Economics at the University of Sussex. In Rome, Angelica Donati. She is President of Ance Giovanni. And in Suffolk in the UK, Anne Pettifor. She is Director of Prime Economics and member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Angelica, to you first. Donald Trump is on record as saying that his favourite word in the entire English language is tariff. We should have seen all of this coming, shouldn't we?
Well, I'm no politician, but it's something that was touted on the campaign trail, and I always think that you should believe people when they say things. So obviously now we are seeing a response from the EU and from the other countries that have been, let's say, subjected to tariffs or threats of tariffs in the beginning of Donald Trump's term. And I think as EU citizens now, we need to look long and hard at what we do on our internal market to not just counter the tariffs, but to also rethink our role as member states in a EU that needs to be stronger and more united now with all of this global competition, which is escalating.
And how much of a concern is this for Europe, not just the European Union, but Europe itself?
I think it is a concern for Europe, but I also think it's a little bit overstated in the sense that it's quite hard to take Donald Trump seriously. He's been issuing a lot of threats, but then withdrawing some of them. So it's really not certain where he's going and how much of this he's really going to do, how much of this American business can tolerate as well. And I can see him shifting as soon as he gets any bad feedback on it.
Maurizio, to you, has he blindsided European business with this? I mean, were people not paying attention? Because we all heard the rhetoric of the campaign trail, as Angelica points out. Tariffs, tax, trade, tariffs. You know, as I say, his favourite word in the English language, apparently.
It's his favorite word. It's also my favorite word. I'm a trade economist, happy to talk about tariffs. But I think that he has blindsided businesses, governments, prime ministers, and so on, in the sense that he talked about tariffs a lot in the campaign, but now no week, no day goes by without news of another sector, another country. And I completely agree that we don't know what will be implemented, But all of these talks, threats, signals are creating a lot of uncertainties. And firms do not like uncertainties. And so that's where everything is at stakes. Everything has been postponed, except the 10% tariffs on China. But what's going to happen to Mexico and Canada? What's going to happen to aluminum and steel and so on and so forth?
So business just likes certainty. People know that they want to have that kind of reassurance.
Yes.
That what we do now, we know that this will stay the same. And he's kicked everything up in the air.
Indeed. Because businesses need to invest, and you don't invest for a return tomorrow, you invest for a return over several years, which also brings open the situation, should I change my production process, should I relocate? What is your time horizon? 4 years, supposedly the time that President Trump will be in the White House, or even longer or shorter? And that is really kicking the can down the road, and firms, I believe, do not know exactly what to do, which may also explain, for example, why the stock markets are possibly calmer than we would have expected, than what is in the media, what is in the headlines. We talk much more than what the reaction in the markets has been. Why? That will be an interesting question.
Angelica, Maurizio mentioned steel. 10% of UK steel is exported to the United States. That is a huge amount of money. How much of a problem would it be for a country like the UK if Donald Trump is good to his word and follows through and does put tariffs on UK steel?
Well, the UK is seeking to find its place in a post-Brexit world where it's also faced with the reality of being one of the US's biggest trade partners. So I think it would be a significant risk. And I mean, just from reading what's been coming up in the news recently, there is a lot of concern within the steel industry. Now, bear in mind, I'm no expert on the sector, but there's been a lot of concern within the steel industry because of this, let's say, softer approach by the UK government towards responding to this threat from the US.
And to you on that point, I mean, is there a feeling that an industry that has taken quite a battering over the last few decades in the UK could suddenly see an opportunity here, perhaps, and reinvigorate itself somehow?
I mean, I'm also not an expert on the steel industry, but I mean, I think, you know, as I said, and I think has been confirmed by the markets, none of this is certain. And as Maurizio says, the real problem is the uncertainty. I'm not sure. I mean, the steel industry in Britain is in any way in great difficulties, and we import an enormous amount of steel. So the fact that we export some of our steel, you know, is part of this very complex arrangement, trading of globalization, essentially. And the point is, the United States is planning to de-globalize, indeed, as many other countries are too. And the question is, what does Britain do about that? It's very hard for us. We are the most open economy in the world. We're the most globalized economy in the world. But for me, the big problem isn't steel and it isn't even tariffs. It's capital mobility. And that's the problem in the United States. That's what's given the United States its problem. And that's a problem that we are not addressing.
So just on that, Maurizio, capital mobility, just spell out to me for our viewers what this is and why there's a problem.
Well, in a nutshell, I think that what Trump is forgetting, or at least putting out there, is that he's obsessed with a trade deficit. But by international standards, a trade deficit means that then the US has a lot of capital movements. You cannot have a balanced trade bilaterally or worldwide without then balancing your capital accounts. So if he were really to be serious and say, let's close all the trade deficit, then Americans will have to start to save much more. Why? Because all the money, the flow of money that is currently going from around the world, and a big chunk from China to the US, will dry up, simply because of a very simple mathematical equation. Are Americans prepared to save more? Are Americans prepared to have less capital mobility, which also means fewer investment into the US? That's the question. So we cannot forget that the trade comes with capital mobility. And the other word that let me throw in, let's not forget about services. There is also a lot of movements of services. We are not only selling and buying steel and cars, but think of the UK, the insurance sector, the banking sector. These are services, and the US has a larger trade surplus in services.
Angelica, I come from Ireland, and I know it was a story which on the face of it this week should really be positive for Ireland. You know, huge, big growth in exports to the United States last year, up 34%. We have a trade surplus with the US of 50 billion euros a year. I mean, for a small country like Ireland, should we be worried now that Trump is going to start looking at where surpluses are and start putting taxes and tariffs on perhaps Irish goods going to the United States?
Well, you know, I'm from a small country with a trade surplus to the US as well, because Italy has around 60 billion of trade to the US every year. So we're in the same boat. And I would say, yes, it is a cause for concern. It is a cause for concern because obviously, I mean, it's, as Mauricio was saying, tit for tat is no good for anybody because we have surpluses in goods, they have surpluses in services. And if you start with tit for tat retaliation, everybody ultimately loses. But on the one hand, domestic consumers in the US will undeniably see price spikes. They'll see price inflation if the US government puts tariffs on imported goods. Producers also will have issues, not because we won't see the cost of the tariffs fall onto our shoulders, but our goods will be less sought after in the market that they're being exported towards. And in the interim, whilst we find different outlets for these products, our GDP growth will stall. I think certain forecasts, which I don't know how correct they are, say that if all these tariffs on the EU, let's say on the EU as a whole, were put in place, this would cost us 1 percentage point of GDP growth per year. And considering that the European GDP growth last year was less than 1%, we can see that we could be teetering on the brink. And this would definitely affect net exporters more so than other countries in the EU.
And to you, I mean, at what point will the American consumer start feeling the pain then if prices start going up and this backfires on Trump?
So, I mean, that pain, I think, is already being felt because not necessarily just because of the tariffs, but because of the uncertainty. I think businesses are beginning to panic. A lot of people who are employed as federal employees are losing their jobs. Research institutions are losing finance. There's an awful lot of disruption, and that's going to be really bad news for the United States people. But I just want to come back to the Irish question because I honestly don't believe any of Ireland's numbers. Ireland's numbers are profoundly distorted by the fact that she is effectively a giant tax haven for companies like Apple and Microsoft and so on that dump all their profits there, and therefore her numbers are not credible. It seems to me. So I really don't think that's a problem. And I think we've got to come back to why is the United States doing this? And I want to argue that there is good cause for this. The United States is, and especially the working people of the United States, have suffered under globalization. They have lost their jobs. Their incomes have fallen. And those who are not in the export sectors, those who are not the 1%, the billionaires investing in China and making huge profits, those people have really suffered. And they occupy what is known as the Rust Belt in the United States. And they are angry, and quite rightly so. But the imbalance is not caused by trade imbalances. It's caused by the fact that the United States is an open market for everybody. So what has happened, as the professor rightly explained, is that people have been investing money in the United States, have been producing stuff for the Americans to buy so that their rates of consumption are extraordinarily high. And now they're complaining about that. And they're complaining because while they may be able to consume all the fancy goods that are coming in from abroad, they may not have a decent job, and they may not have decent health care, and they may not be able to send their kids to university. And they're mad as hell about that. And they want a strong man, Donald Trump, to protect them from these forces. But he's not doing that. He's trying to protect them, supposedly, from trade. And he's not trying very hard at that, in my view. But he won't do nothing about Wall Street or about Silicon Valley and their capital flows away from the United States and into countries like China and elsewhere.
Anne, excellent points just on that. So here we get to why he's doing this. This is ultimately playing to his core base of voters?
Sure, and I think there is a point, as Anne was pointing out, that globalization doesn't come with no cost. Trade, and that's what I teach in the first lecture of my international trade, gives rise to redistribution of wealth. Not everyone gains. The world, the country gains, but then what politicians should really keep in mind are those regulation, redistributive policy that can make the pie not only bigger for the country, but slightly bigger for everyone. Now, the way to go about it, however, simply in the limit shutting down the trade channel is not the solution, because the tariffs that already President Trump in his first mandate put in place, although he was saying, oh, the Chinese will pay for these tariffs, all the economic analysis that has been done, and now that we have enough years past, demonstrate that American consumers that pay for that. So on the one hand, going back to the argument that Anne was making, the consumers in the Rust Belt and also beyond that are upset, but they are also the one paying the cost of it, because these tariffs are regressive. So percentage-wise, are the poorer family that bear most of the cost of these tariffs.
Angelica, let's look at solutions. How then can European countries start dealing with Donald Trump's America?
Well, there is, I think, one singular answer to this, which is an answer that perhaps many European countries don't like. And it was actually just given today by Mario Draghi during a presentation at the European Parliament. European countries need to start thinking more as parts of a whole rather than individual entities that are not connected to one another. We need to start thinking as Europeans as if we were a single country, because ultimately what has been happening over the course of the past few decades, but it's accelerating now, and it's a separate topic, but it's still connected also with regards to defense spending and the newfound attitude towards the conflict in the Ukraine. If we don't start thinking of ourselves as a European, I wouldn't say country, but as a solid bloc with shared interests and perhaps a shared budget, which mirrors what was done for the recovery fund for COVID, but is spent on other projects as well, which is basically what was proposed in Mario Draghi's report to the European Commission in September. If we don't start spending together, planning together, investing for a united European future, then we will be squished or crushed between the US on one side and China on the other, and that's inevitable.
And that same point to you then, do you think it's time Europe got its act together, got together and acted as one?
Absolutely. And I want to just emphasize that what's happened to the Rust Belt in the United States has happened to German and Italian and Greek workers too. So what we're seeing in Europe is the same problem we have in the United States, is the export orientation of the whole of the European economy. And the repression, if you like, of incomes, of salaries, of wages at home. So those who are connected to the export sector have done very well, especially the wealthy. Those who work at home have found, number one, that their wages have been repressed, sometimes quite deliberately, if you think about the Hartz reforms in Germany. But secondly, that actually they not only have they been repressed, but secondly, Europe has been so determined to impose fiscal austerity from the time of the great financial crisis right through to today. And what I thought was so powerful about what Mario Draghi said in the Financial Times at the weekend is that Europe has harmed itself. It didn't need to have tariffs to harm itself. It harmed itself with its fiscal austerity, with its and he compared the amount of money that the government of the United States has injected into the American economy, something like $23 trillion since 2009, compared to, I can't remember the number, but it's in about $8 or $9 trillion here in Europe since the GFC. In other words, governments have very deliberately retrenched. You know, there was this great big cavity, this great big hole inside the economy as a result of the great financial crisis. And the government sat on its hands and said, nothing to do with me, let's leave it to the markets to fix that big hole in the economy. The United States didn't. The government invested and spent money, and most remarkably under President Biden, injected money, which then revives the private sector, which then revived confidence in the private sector. Europe has done the very reverse. And so there's been this doubling down, if you like, on working people in Europe. One, the Hartz reforms and those repressive policies that kept wages down. And on the other hand, the absolute determination to balance budgets and to impose austerity across the Union. It's been disastrous, and Europe has to fix that.
So Maurizio, just come in on that point. Anne reckons Europe has been its own worst enemy, never mind Donald Trump.
Well, there is some truth in it. Now, let's not forget what the European Union has achieved, but it is the case that we speak, or they speak, since we are based in London, of the single market, but there are a lot of barriers in the single market. If Angelica, based in Rome, wants to open a bank account in France, she cannot. Why? Because the single market doesn't cover services. But that clearly means that, to carry on the example, the banking system in France doesn't look at the EU to be the market over which to have the potential of gaining economies of scale and so on and so forth. And this is just an example. So I fully subscribe to what Mario Draghi wrote in the Financial Times last weekend, following up his report. Clearly, there is a lot that Europe can do, but let's not fool ourselves that this will happen next week. And even if it were to happen next week, in the sense that 27 prime ministers sign a piece of paper, it will take time to materialize. So now, in the short run, we still have to ask ourselves, what do we do in order to countervail the actions or the words, maybe only words, of Donald Trump? And that is still a challenge, and a challenge in which the UK, coming back to your starting point, tries to be in the middle. They want to be a bridge between the US and the EU, both in terms of economics, but maybe also in terms of political, geopolitical alignment because of Ukraine and so on and so forth. And that's where there is also uncertainty, not only on the firm side, but also on the politician side. We saw they met yesterday in Paris, and it seems that there are already some cracks among the various leaders, political cracks. So how many more economic cracks will we see in the coming weeks?
Angelica, how much of a problem for the UK is being outside of the European Union now, given the Trump situation, the potential for tariffs? Britain finds itself in a very difficult position.
So from my point of view, but I was always very much anti-Brexit. I think it does it no good. I think this freedom to do what it wants outside of the EU is actually not freedom at all. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. When you're stuck between two massive trading blocs like the US and China, going at it alone is not the answer. Perhaps as from a kind of international political standpoint, as a negotiator and as a mediator, there can be a role for the UK as kind of like a free player. But in terms of the markets and in terms of the fact that, well, as Anne was rightly saying, the UK's market is the most open and global that there is, also because the UK is pretty much a net importer of everything. So I think right now the country stands in a position of great potential weakness and great risk from this escalating tit-for-tat trade war, which might, let's say, detonate at any point.
And final point to you, Britain stands with great risk and great weakness. Used to be Great Britain.
Quite right. And can I say that, I'm very worried about our Prime Minister's position and his attempt to, be on both sides. I think he doesn't understand how much of a threat Donald Trump's administration is to Britain and to our security, and never mind our economic security. So we have to put our own house in order, and by hoping that we can keep up our friendship with the United States, we will not be putting our own house in order. But I want to come back to the European Union as a whole. I really think that there's very little you can do about what Donald Trump has got. He's got a massive mandate. The Americans are going to have to sort themselves out. That's going to take time. We have to restore aggregate demand back here in Europe and in Britain. And we have to reverse the policies which so extremely oriented our economies towards exports and so neglected the development of the domestic economy through both public intervention but also private intervention. And I think Britain has as big a job to do to get that right. And we've not mentioned climate breakdown yet. We haven't yet mentioned the biggest security threat of it all. The thing that breaks my heart is that we're going to have Keynesian demand policies applied to the military. Once again, it is going to take a war before governments wake up to the fact that they do have to intervene to ensure the security of their country, their economic security as well as their military security. But it takes a war for the governments to understand that. You know, we've had an ideological bias where you could not use the words aggregate demand amongst economists. It was sort of a kind of blasphemy. You could only obsess over the supply side of the economy. And that bias, that ideological bias, has done us enormous harm. And we've got to correct it if we want to survive this onslaught from the United States.
And thank you. Final point to Maurizio. Just briefly, Maurizio, you said the business loves certainty. 2025 is going to be a year of complete uncertainty.
Well, let's be optimistic, maybe only the first semester of 2025. But I also want to say that, yes, firms like certainty, but firms and global value chains have also proved to be very resilient. Think of COVID and the disruptions. Think of earthquakes, natural disasters, the war in Ukraine. There were many commentators and economists saying, oh, what's going to happen? The global value chain will drop down. In the end, there is resilience in the system. Clearly, every shock imposes further pushes and further moving away from the optimal efficient level. But I also have a strong believer in the ability and the entrepreneurial spirit of firms. Clearly, politicians should make their life easier, not more difficult.
Maurizio, thank you, and to Angelica and Anne as well. Wonderful contributions, all of you. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.